Morning, everyone. Happy hump day. Welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's political correspondent, Ashley Cowburn. Morning, Ash.
Morning.
Now, this is the People's pay-per-view. So those of you listening later on podcast, you're just going to have to sort of see if you can run for office and see if anybody gets excited about it. The rest of you, please get into the comments and ask us your questions. So what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on the fact that nearly 3 million food parcels were handed out in the UK last year, 1 million of them for children. More on that later. But first, I want us to turn our attention to the US, where President Joe Biden surprised absolutely nobody last night with his first official confirmation that he is running again for president. And he will be 81 years old when people go to the polls. So, Ash, I suppose the question is this the hubris of a man who just can't let go of power? Or is he the best or indeed the only chance the Democrats have got of winning?
Yeah, so this is the news that Joe Biden is seeking a second term. And as you say, no one should be surprised because he's been saying this all along. But this was the official announcement last night with this sort of slick political video, which perhaps some of our politicians in the UK could learn from a little bit. So he starts this video with the opening credits are like of the US Capitol when Donald Trump supporters marched on the Capitol on January the 6th after the election in 2020. And then it sort of shows that mob entering the Capitol, and there's this images of the abortion protesters over the Supreme Court overturning the historic Roe versus Wade ruling. And then you get him saying, "Let me finish the job. You've sent me here to do this for 4 years. I'm seeking another four-year term." And I think it's worth pointing out that it is actually quite rare for US presidents to lose a second term. I think the last one was obviously Donald Trump after his first term. Before that, it was George Bush Sr. So they do tend to win their second terms when they seek office. Given the sort of volatility in American politics at the moment and in the UK politics, I think it's extremely difficult to predict what's going to happen in November 2024. It's worth mentioning as well that we're probably going to see a UK election at the same time, or maybe perhaps just before it. So it's certainly
too much politics. It's going to be unbearable. We'll have to sort of see how some of that turns out, I suppose. What do you think, everybody? What do you think about Joe Biden running for office? Is this a good idea? Do you think that he should perhaps be putting his feet up a bit? Let us know what you think. Now, at the moment, it looks like he might be facing, as Ash was saying there, Donald Trump again. And that sort of sets the scene for a rematch between the two of them. And while it might be very tempting to hope that Trump gets beaten twice, would he still take that as a beating? Probably still complain about it. There's always a chance, especially with the daft US voting system, of it going the other way. So, Ash, what's your bead on this? How do you think Biden would actually fare against Trump? And would he perhaps be facing the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, who seems to be coming forward?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it doesn't look at the moment that Joe Biden is going to face a challenge within the Democratic Party itself. So it doesn't seem like there'll be a primary race. I think it was not Joe Biden. It was Bernie Sanders, the left-wing senator for Vermont. He came out last night saying he's not going to run for president in 2024 for the Democrats.
Well, he's even older than Joe, isn't he?
I think he might be slightly younger, but I might be wrong on that.
Okay.
He came out last night saying he's not going to run for the US president and endorsing Joe Biden. So they seem pretty united on that front, that Joe Biden's going to be their candidate. Obviously, there's quite a long time to go, so more people might come out the woodwork. But it does appear from all the soundings that Donald Trump is going to go for a second run at the White House, coming back from his huge loss in the last presidential election in the States.
With the benefit of a huge amount of publicity as well over all his court cases he's going to be getting free.
Yes, it could perhaps be the first. I think he's already the first American president in history to be charged with facing criminal charges. But that obviously is not going to stop him from running for office, bizarrely. But I think the polls at the moment are pretty lukewarm on Joe Biden. I think he does have a slight lead when it comes to sort of facing Donald Trump, but it's a much slimmer contest if it was, as you mentioned, the Florida Governor Rob DeSantis. I think the polls are quite sort of matched on that one. So it's I mean, it's all to play for. But it does seem that Joe Biden has a bit of a step ahead at the moment.
Yes, well, someone letting him have a bit of a head start anyway won't hurt. Apparently, Bernie Sanders is 81, so he's a year older than Biden.
Oh, okay.
Just had a quick Google while we're on air. Now, Mike says it's astonishing that a man who raised a mob to attack Congress when he lost is still allowed to stand for president again. It's one of those things, isn't it, Ash, that when the founding fathers sort of wrote the US Constitution, they didn't consider that they considered lots of different possibilities of how they were going to control the presidency, but they don't seem to have expressly worked out that someone who might run for president might also be a criminal, because they didn't say that was not a goer. They were kind of, they left that one out for up to the voters, I suppose. Is that, maybe that's just them being super democratic as opposed to them trying to clean up politics? Or did they think perhaps, maybe, I don't know, that any possible presidents might be, you know, technically someone who had committed a crime, say, against the British state or something at the time, and they thought there wasn't anything too wrong with it. It seems to have been a bit of an oversight on their part. Now, Biden is running again with Kamala Harris as VP, even though their poll ratings between them are quite low. But they haven't got a lot of other Democrat frontrunners to choose from, so they may be the safe pair of hands. But do you think, Ash, maybe this boils down a little bit to the choice between electing a maniac or electing an old man? Because, you know, the voters, if you're asked to pick the one who won't launch the nuclear missiles, you know, it's like, even if it is only because he can't remember where he left the launch codes, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, Joe Biden will be 86 by the end of his second term. But I'm not entirely convinced that his age is a sort of barring factor on him running for office. I mean, in the UK, you tend to have seeing a lot more younger prime ministers and politicians at the moment. But in the US, I mean, obviously, he's a very experienced politician who's in the Senate for a long time. And the American economy does seem to be slightly improving. I think he was mentioning that manufacturing was back up in his presidential speech yesterday. But I do think he already sees in this race his competitor is Donald Trump. I mean, it was so clear from the video yesterday with those scenes from the Capitol on January 6th, with the abortion is healthcare rights. And just saying, he mentioned what he said in the last presidential race, which was, this is a battle for the soul of America. And he's saying we're still here. This is not time to be a complacent. This is time for 4 more years of me to sort of finish the job.
Well, it's going to be interesting. Like you said, the incumbent always seems to do a slightly better. Maybe just by sort of making it about him standing forward, he's trying to encourage them to pick Trump because he knows he's got a better chance against them. Maybe he's playing a bit of politics there. Maria says, the world is going through crazy times enhanced by crazy leaders who seem to set the agendas. God help the common folk. I don't think God ever has, Maria, but that one's, I suppose, up for the theologists, isn't it? Now, thank you, everyone, for that. Now, to the main story of the day that we need to talk about, and it's that front page about food banks, which it features the Newcastle striker Callum Wilson, who says, I was that child once. And inside there, he talks about growing up as the oldest of 6 kids to a single mum and how they struggled to survive. But his proud mum didn't want to accept food donations from anyone else, but they had to. They didn't have a choice. He talks about, you know, playing football with his toes sticking out the outside in the school playground and stuff like this. Now, Ash, in 2013, the Mirror launched a big campaign. I can remember. You were probably still at school or something, I don't know, because the Trussel Trust had handed out then, in 2013, 300,000 food parcels, just as the austerity measures were really beginning to bite. So what's happened in the 10 years since? Why are we still reporting on this?
Well, I was at university, not school, so slightly older than you.
University.
But I mean, so Rosamund Jones, who's obviously written about this quite a lot, she writes in a column just above the main story there with the interview with Callum Wilson that, as you mentioned, when she was reporting in 2013, sort of raising the issue of food poverty in the UK, there was 300,000 parcels given out by the Trussel Trust. We're now at the situation where it's 3 million in the last year, and that was a 37% increase just on last year. So obviously, I mean, the big sort of impact over the last year has been the cost of living crisis and energy prices as an impact of the war in Ukraine. But I mean, that it's not just that. I mean, if you look at the sort of graphs going back from 2010, it's sort of steadily increased in every single year, but it went up sort of significantly last year as well. And I think one of the main issues is this. I mean, the Trussel Trust often says this is not about food; it's about sort of the access to money. And I think one of the things lacking in this debate is the lack of conversation about what levels of benefits are in the UK, whether they are too low. Because I think during the pandemic, they introduced the £20 uplift in universal credit, which to me felt like a sort of admission that benefit levels were already too low. And obviously that was taken away, despite many warnings from campaigners and charities across the country. But when you look at the sort of levels of benefits and the sort of one of the most pernicious aspects of the welfare state, so you're talking about the sort of bedroom tax, the 2-child policy, benefit sanctions, which studies have shown could lead people to use food banks, it's no surprise that you're seeing these sort of big numbers coming towards them. And I think those aspects need re-looking at. And I think both the major political parties are kind of absent on this field at the moment.
Then it's not really perhaps seen as a vote winner to say we're going to increase benefits, is it? Now Mike says the governor of the Bank of England says people have to accept that we are poorer. I assume that doesn't apply to billionaires and CEOs, or indeed the governor of the Bank of England, who I think is on somewhere between 500,000 and £1 million a year. He's not much poorer. And I do tend to think, Ash, that the people who make the decision to take 20 quid away from families are the ones to whom 20 quid doesn't matter. And it's never particularly mattered, and they've always had 20 quid in their wallet, whereas the people they're taking it from are the ones who can make 20 quid stretch to an extra couple of meals quite easily. So the problem we've got with the Trussel Trust is that it's 10 times worse than it was a decade ago, 300,000 up to nearly 3 million. And without looking at Twitter, we could probably name between us a couple of Tory MPs who will be out there today on social media telling the world this is all a result of the food banks just existing, handing out free food, as opposed to there actually being a real need for these things. Do you think the government registers, Ash, that this isn't a good look, or does it just not care because, like I said, the people who know all about food banks aren't their voters in the first place?
Well, I think the government, I don't think they'd say the latter, but they would certainly say that, for example, in April, that state benefits and levels went up by about 10%, so just under inflation. I'm sure they would point to that and the various cost of living schemes that are available at the moment. But I think in the red wall seats that they won in 2019, those sort of particular areas of poverty, I think they should be caring a bit more about this. And obviously with the local elections coming up next week, whether this will play into that, I'm not sure. But I think it's not just the Conservative Party, though. I mean, where is the Labour Party on this field? I don't know what they're saying on welfare at the moment, but they seem to be sort of examining the welfare state and not coming out with any sort of concrete proposals at the moment. Whether that changes in the next few months remains to be seen. But yeah, I think like as Rosamund Jones writes in her column, this crisis isn't an accident. It's a sort of decade in the making.
Yeah, exactly. And it's got to be said that, although the government is saying we've put up benefits by 10.1% this year, which is in line with inflation, that is, for a single person under 25, it's gone from £61 to £67.20. £6 extra a week. If you're over 25, it's gone from £77 to £84. I mean, that's £7. That's not going to keep the wolf from the door, particularly, is it? One of the really big problems the food banks are facing is that demand's gone up 37%, but donations have dropped because the people who donate to food banks are the ones who know what it means to be hungry. And and they just don't have the cash spare to do it now because of the cost of living crisis. I mean, Labour and Ros there are saying that a lot of this is to do with the economic failures of the government, as opposed to it just being about the benefit system. Do you buy that? Is it because the economy hasn't grown enough? Are we going to invoke the spirit of Liz Truss here and say we need more growth and that would fix this problem?
I think obviously you need more growth, but I'm not sure it would fix the problem. I think even when you had growth in the UK, food bank use was going up. It's about priorities, really. I mean, do you cut taxes? Do you raise benefits? I think these are issues that politicians have to grapple with. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's all about choices and who you decide to support in a society. And I think it's quite clear from these figures today who the government have decided not to support. I think, as Callum Wilson mentions, I think he's in his interview today with the Mirror, he's speaking to a food bank manager who sounds alarmed that they have had a decrease in funding over the last year as well, because of, obviously, as you mentioned, the sort of cost of living impacts sort of biting into people's wages, and those people typically donate to food banks and sort of donate to them even when they're doing their own food shops, but perhaps can't afford to do that anymore.
Exactly. Now, Joseph says, this government's policies, along with Brexit, have made the people of this country poorer, and we reverted to a pre-1970s state, but even worse, because there weren't any food banks in the 1960s. It's interesting you point this out, Joseph, because one of the things that the critics of the Trussel Trust, if there are such people, and I suppose there are in the Conservative Party, but they say that the fact that these food banks didn't used to exist shows that, when people were very hungry, they didn't need food banks. And that the fact that there are now people taking these food parcels shows that actually it's not real hunger. It's because there's free food to go and get, even though you have to get a referral from the GP and even all the rest of it. But Ash, I mean, the problem with that argument is that what Joseph says here, that it was worse because there weren't food banks back then. And my mum and dad can remember having sugar sandwiches and bread and dripping because there wasn't anything else. There was no other money to put food on the table. And just because people used to be hungry and sort of managed to survive somehow, some of them, it doesn't mean that that's the way we should be carrying on now, is it really?
No, I mean, I think it's kind of insulting to suggest it's just free, people are going after free food.
Yeah.
But I think, the Trussel Trust itself sort of went from 1 to 1,400 centres in the space of 20 years. It's only existed for 20 years. And there obviously are other food banks around the country, which these figures don't take into account. But I think maybe perhaps before the Trussel Trust times, there was a bit more sort of community dependency and sort of supporting each other within their own community, perhaps a bit more than that happens now. But I think sort of they, I don't know, going forward, I think there need to be more studies into food bank uses and what the sort of main drivers behind it. I think previous ones have suggested that benefit sanctions are one of the reasons what drives people towards food bank use. And I think it's obviously quite difficult to separate the impact of the government's policies on the present day to sort of use of people being in food poverty pre-2010. But I think the studies are the ones that have come out over the last few years are sort of pinpointing some of those policies, saying they have sort of extenuated circumstances a lot worse.
What do you think, everybody? Have you had to use a food bank? Do you know someone who has? Do you think that they're kind of causing the problem or somehow magnifying it? Or do you think they're the ones that are alleviating it? What's the problem from your point of view? Is it the benefit sanctions that suddenly sort of take someone's income away and they have a bit of a struggle for a few weeks and they need to go to use the food bank for a bit and then they can, get back on their feet when the benefits kick back in? Now, demand has risen, according to this article, by 37%. Donations have dropped. Now, last year, the Trussel Trust put out 26 million meals, right? More than double what they did 5 years ago. And the number of children has gone from less than 500,000 to 1.1 million food parcels for kids in the same period of time. Now, referrals have gone up by more than a third. And the Trust says, as Ashley's been talking about there, that a big part of this is the changes to the benefit system, which sort of subsidises low wages that people are on. It means that people can't always afford the essentials, doesn't it, Ash? It seems to be that, like you were saying at the start, the benefit system, which is supposed to be there to provide a safety net for people, just isn't catching people enough. It's not, and part of that maybe is inflation, and it's going to change a bit at that, but it's got to be made more reasonable. Why aren't Labour doing more to say what they would do with this? Because if Labour said we're going to pay X more on benefits, then the Tories would have to start addressing that and start thinking about it too. It would put pressure on the government, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I do think you're probably going to hear more from Jonathan Ashworth, the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary for Labour, within the next few months, as sort of Labour continues setting out its policies and manifesto for government. But I think, as you say, the people are sort of relying on, especially over the last year, sort of they're seeing their wages sort of decrease in real terms. Food prices are going up by the biggest level since 1970s. Inflation's up a 40-year high. And all these aspects, in addition to some of the aspects of the welfare state that are already existing, are sort of pushing people towards food banks. I don't think these figures that are out today are very surprising, to be honest. I think anyone that's shocked by them should probably have a check what's going on around the country. But I think it's hard to see what's going to happen next. I mean, perhaps it could fall slightly next year as energy prices are expected to go down over the summer months. But I think
but that's just inflation itself going down. The increase is slowing down, isn't it? We're going back to the prices they used to be. We're not dropping 10% on all the prices.
And then obviously, as one of the, I think it was Mike mentioned on the comments before, you have this economist from the Bank of England coming out on the same day as these figures. Well, I think he came out last night, and these figures have dropped this morning from the Trussel Trust, saying sort of Brits need to accept that they should be poorer. I'm not sure that's something that people need to accept. I think you definitely do not have to accept that, especially from someone who's on a salary of £180,000, which is significantly more than the median income of UK household, which is about £30,000. It's quite rich him saying that. So I'm sure there'll be some backlash to those comments, as there were to Andrew Bailey last year, the governor of the Bank of England, who suggested that workers shouldn't be asking for pay rises on a salary of £500,000.
No, exactly. That's it. Andrew Bailey, who was mentioned earlier on, is the governor of Bank of England. He earns £495,000 a year. It's about £300 an hour. Now, it is a big and important job, but a lot of what he's working for, of course, is his pension, which is going to mean that his old age is nicely looked after as well, which not everybody else gets. Now, Maria says, we need politicians who care, not career politicians who line their own pockets with expenses and freebies. She's got such a point here, Ash, because, you know, if no matter whether these are your voters or not who are at the food banks, the fact is that if there are people using food banks, there are people who aren't earning very much. There are people who aren't being properly nourished. There are children growing up unable to learn and not getting the right qualifications and not getting into the good jobs. There are whole areas, sectors, towns, boroughs, council wards where people are just not able to work harder to get more money. They're just stuck in this awful cycle of poverty, and no one is helping them out of it. And they can't do what, you know, the Tory Norman Tebbit said years ago, which is to get on your bike and look for work, because the work, no matter where you go, is low wages everywhere. And industrial action and goodness knows what else. And people can't travel if they haven't got the money, because the bus services have been cut and the train services have been cut, and you can't afford to put petrol in your car and goodness knows what else. People cannot make themselves and work harder, and everyone wants to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but they can't do it without a little bit of help. Just even someone pointing out where the bootstrap is or how to pull yourself up, or giving them a bit of a hand when they're on the bottom of the heap. It's all very well to think to yourself, if you're the Tory Prime Minister, or Keir Starmer for that matter, and think, well, people who use food banks aren't going to vote, so it doesn't really matter, we don't need to address this issue. But it all pays into the general economic story of the country. It does all affect us. We're not, you know, we are not an island. We are affected by the rest of mankind, and it affects our communities, it affects our schools, it affects our taxes, it affects everything. They must surely see the benefit of doing something about benefits.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, there needs to be this national conversation about the levels of benefits in this country, whether people want to allow this to continue to happen, this sort of 3 million food parcels being given out by food banks each year. I mean, we've seen stark figures about child poverty and poverty across country in recent months. And there needs to be, I mean, for example, the £20 per week universal credit uplift that I mentioned earlier that was introduced during the pandemic was an admission, to my mind, effectively, that the levels of welfare in this country are not high enough. But the government, when they removed that, I think Rishi Sunak as Chancellor removed that in the end of 2021, refused to release impact assessments on what this would mean. And even a year later refused to release those impact assessments as well. So I suspect there wasn't good news in those assessments, given their sort of tendency.
Why do it if it's such bad news for people? I mean, it's madness, because it like we're just saying, it affects every single person. And if you know what you're doing is damaging the people of the country that you are supposed to be serving, then you're not serving the country, are you? You're screwing it. Sorry, but it's not an acceptable way to carry on and just think, well, these people didn't vote for me, I don't need to worry about them. That's not how MPs act. MPs are supposed to act for all their constituents, and it's not what a prime minister or a government or a secretary of state is supposed to act. They act for everybody, regardless of how they voted. Idiots. Why don't we get people in charge who know something about what they're doing, and have at the very least just once found themselves at the till and having to put something back on the shelf because they were 23 pence short? That's all I want out of life. I don't want any other qualifications to be an MP or a Prime Minister, just someone who knows the actual value of money. Right, thank you for that, Ash. Thank you, everyone, for helping us through some of those with the questions. We're going to have a wrap at the end. So what do you think about Joe Biden running for office again? What do you think Trump's chances are against him? Do you think Trump might actually take it if he got beaten twice? Do you think he'd get the message? Or do you think he's going to just launch another insurrection? Who knows? And what do you feel about food bank usage and what the government should be doing about it? What would you like to see the Labour Party suggesting as a policy? And where's the money going to come from if they do it? But first of all, we have found some good news in the world for you. And here it is. Now, this might be the best animal story you're going to hear all day. It's a Labrador called Vinnie who can get you a drink from the fridge. Not only that, but he is able to pop his owner's dislocated joints back into place, hand over her card to pay for groceries, and help her use cash machines, as well as fetching the post. Now, Sue Holmes has got a rare condition which had made life almost impossible, it sounds, before Vinnie came along, with the help of a charity called Canine Partners. And her life has been transformed by him, not least because her condition means her joints often dislocate. And Vinnie has been trained to pull on his harness a certain way until she tells him to stop, which means he can sort of put pressure on them to get them back into place. So, Ash, Vinnie can do pretty much anything that he's asked of, really. Asked of him, and all in return for just an ear scratch, which, as soon as we've been talking about low wages, is a pretty good deal for Sue, I should think. But of course, for a dog, it is the highest of all rewards. Is this proof, do you think, that truly appreciating one's staff will always bring the best out of them?
I think it really is. I think this little Vinnie, 8-year-old Vinnie, is obviously an amazing dog. If only I had Vinnie when I was a bit younger. I had a King Charles Cavalier when I was younger who took on my paper round every morning and definitely did not help me deliver the newspapers or anything like that.
Yes,
which would have been helpful.
Vinnie has been perhaps slightly better trained than most dogs. It's cost £30,000 to raise a support dog and train a support dog like Vinnie. So if you can find Canine Partners, bung them a £5 because they're doing amazing work. And there's several charities that do that kind of stuff. It costs a lot of money. Vinnie is working as well, so he will be retiring somewhere else when he gets to the right age. But I think the fact that someone can can train a dog to do that, and the dog wants to do all that, and is just absolutely marvelous. And heart goes out to Sue for the problems that she's had, but at least she's got Vinnie helping her, because I suspect the government probably isn't very much. Anyway, on that note, thank you everybody for taking us through all this. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for Ash for explaining it all to us. We'll have to wait and see, won't we, how things pan out in the next few months with Biden and Trump, maybe both running for office. Maria says politicians could do with going to the same training school as Canine Partners, teach them how to care. And on that note, everybody, thank you, Maria, for that. You will get a News Agenda mug, get into the my messages and give me your address, and you will be sent a News Agenda mug for giving us the comment of the show. Thank you for that, everyone. If you're listening to on the podcast, please leave us a review for other people to find us, and come back about noon, because on these channels the Mirror will be broadcasting the Prime Minister's questions with Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, who probably won't be talking about benefits at all, but Sudan, something else instead. We'll have to see, won't we? Until then, we'll see you again on Monday for another edition of the News Agenda. But until then, everybody, tatty bye.